This is MacroVoices with hedge fund manager Erik Townsend, the free weekly financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. MacroVoices is all about the brightest minds in the world of finance and macroeconomics telling it like it is, bullish or bearish, no holds barred. Now, here are your hosts, Erik Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
MacroVoices episode 313 was recorded on March 3rd, 2022. I'm Erik Townsend. This episode is brought to you by Abaxx Technologies, pioneering the design of smarter markets that better serve the needs of both market participants and society as a whole. And by Masterworks, the billion-dollar alternative investment platform that lets you invest in art by legends like Warhol and Picasso for a fraction of the cost. There are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen, and this has been a week when decades happened. The title of this week's episode, World War III Has Already Started, is not clickbait written in response to the military escalation in Ukraine. That was indeed the title of a blog post penned by my feature interview guest, Dr. Pippa Malmgren. But it might surprise you to learn that Pippa published that post with that title back on October 29th of last year, anticipating rather than reacting to this week's news. In this week's feature interview, we'll discuss the situation in Ukraine, but we'll be looking at it in the context of a bigger picture that led Pippa and other prominent thought leaders to predict a major escalation of war tensions long before this particular crisis erupted. Then be sure to stay tuned for our postgame segment when Patrick's chart deck is titled Intermarket Frenzy. What's next?
And I'm Patrick Ceresna. Erik, let's jump to that S&P 500. I mean, we're very oversold and did capitulate last week, like we talked about in the chart deck. But I don't know. Do you think that this rally is going to stick? I mean, it was certainly a very violent start to the rally off of those very oversold lows. But the market's been actually surprisingly quiet over the last few days in terms of making any move of significance. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I definitely agree that the volatility is less than I would have expected for the last couple of days. But as I've said before on the show, people tend to think when a war starts, oh boy, market's going to crash, it's a war. In reality, wars tend to be bullish for the stock market after an initial panic spike down. So are we starting to see the beginning of that? I think that what might be affecting this, or might be part of the picture here, is for a long time, I just couldn't see how we would avoid a major move lower in stock prices, because I just couldn't see how the Fed could possibly backpedal out of the tightening cycle that they've committed to. Now, suddenly, with all of these war tensions on the table, I think anything is possible. And maybe that's creating speculation that the Fed is not going to have to stay the course on their previous commitments around the tightening cycle in the face of this new war dynamic that we're looking at. But at the end of the day, Patrick, I don't claim to know what's happening here with the stock market. I think there's strong arguments to be made in both directions.
All right, well, let's move on to the dollar index, because after a quick little pop and drop last week, the dollar actually continues to remain strong, largely driven by euro breakdown, which I'll have a chart of in the post-game chart book. But the dollar strength is holding new highs. Do you think there's potential we're going to the 100 handle, or is this a new move?
Patrick, as Pippa will explain in today's feature interview, this event is not just about Ukraine. It's part of a bigger picture, and it's a long way from over. So I do think that war pressures are driving the dollar. That's the reason for the dollar's strength. I expect that strength to continue. Now, there is an argument, which is, well, wait a minute, would the dollar eventually crash as the dollar loses hegemony in a new world where perhaps with the changing geopolitical considerations, maybe the world is ready for a different global reserve currency? Yeah, that will be a really big story, no doubt in my mind. That's going to happen someday, but not yet. I think right now it's dollar up on war risk, and the scenario where the dollar loses its hegemony over the financial system because of an evolving, changing political climate, that's not a certainty. It's only a possibility, and it's a future possibility, not a here and now.
All right, well, let's move on to crude oil because last week I thought it was pretty impressive the way crude oil popped to 100 and then the volatility bringing it back. But boy, this week was a whole next level. I mean, we ripped up to about 116 on the upside in crude, and suddenly the crude oil market is just running. What's your take on how this is playing out?
Well, let's start with inventory. Crude oil drawing down 2.6 million barrels this week. Cushing, Oklahoma drawing down 972,000 barrels. Gasoline drawing down 468,000 barrels. Distillates drawing down 574,000 barrels, with U.S. production remaining flat at 11.6 million barrels. Clearly, though, the Russia-Ukraine war situation is dominating the news and overshadowing inventory. And I'm going to editorialize here a little bit, Patrick, and just say I am appalled at some of the analysts who I otherwise respect very highly, who are making new calls for big SPR releases in order to combat higher gas prices at the pump. Look, the reason that we have a strategic petroleum reserve is in order, for the sake of national security, to make sure that we've got backup oil if we have exactly the kind of geopolitical escalation which has occurred this week. If anything, we should be at any cost topping off the SPR in order to make sure it's full for when we actually need it, not abusing it for a purpose for which it was never created, trying to use it to manage gasoline prices at the pump ahead of the next round of midterm elections or whatever the logic is. I think it's incredibly irresponsible to be thinking in terms of using the SPR to manage prices now. We need to save the SPR for strategic reasons for which it was created. This is a really big deal between the West and Russia, and I think Ukraine is really just in the middle of it, and it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes, Patrick. But as far as prices from here, I think, if anything, I could argue that the market is underpricing risk, and I think that a lot of the dialogue that I'm hearing, people are talking about, well, wait a minute, there's going to be U.S. sanctions against Russia, but they're not really going to pick on the energy, and it sounds like if they kick them out of SWIFT, there's going to be carve-outs for energy, so we're still going to be able to pay for the energy that we want to buy from Russia, so we don't have to worry about losing that supply. Hang on, folks. Stop thinking about what the West does. Start thinking about what's it going to feel like when Russia makes the decision, we're cutting you off. We're not going to sell any more gas or oil to Europe, and the valve gets shut off this afternoon, whether you like it or not, regardless of price. We need to be ready for escalation of geopolitical tension to put more pressure on energy prices, and I don't think people who are just worried about whether or not there's a carve-out in the SWIFT sanctions are really seeing the big picture of what's probably about to happen here.
All right, well, let's move on to gold. And while gold did have a little bit of a pop and drop last week, overall, gold seems to be well accumulated. It seems every dip is being bought and is holding well above 1900. We're trading around 1936 at the time of recording here. Do you think that this is the start of a new gold bull move, or is this going to be faded as soon as there's de-escalation?
Well, I think it's already been faded, and I don't know why. If gold were really the ultimate geopolitical risk hedge that the gold bugs tell you it is, it ought to be $500 higher as far as I'm concerned. This is arguably about as close as you get to a Cuban Missile Crisis kind of moment. We don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes, and we wouldn't find out until it was too late. But the setup for another Cuban Missile Crisis level of geopolitical risk of a global nuclear escalation, all the ingredients are there, and we got gold pretty much floundering around, keeping above the moving averages, but not really showing much of a move. So I would say, if anything, gold is very badly underpricing the risk, or gold was never really the geopolitical risk hedge that so many people make it out to be. I'm quite surprised that it's not quite a bit higher here.
All right, and let's wrap up with just a quick touch on the 10-year Treasury yield, which surprisingly has been backing off. And this is an interesting kind of moment because you have a scenario where with the rising commodity prices, you know that there's going to be inflation pressures. And yet what we're seeing is there's this tug of war with, bonds being almost like a safe haven asset versus the inflation that should theoretically priced into this yield. And we're bouncing around. We're down to 185 on the yield. We were were as low as 170. Do you have any interpretation on how this bond market is moving here?
Well, the way I'm interpreting it, Patrick, is the bond market clearly ought to be just nosediving in yield because we've got a major safety trade event, one of the biggest geopolitical escalations, certainly of our lifetimes. And you're down, 12 basis points or something from where it was before all of this started. It says to me that inflation pressure is very much still there. And when you see what might have otherwise been a much bigger move down in yields, I think it was countered by that lingering inflation pressure, and war pressure is not going to help with inflation either.
All right, well, this week's feature interview guest is former presidential advisor and best-selling author, Dr. Pippa Malmgren. Erik, why did we get Pippa back this week?
Patrick, this interview was scheduled long before the Ukraine situation developed. The first thing that happened was another favorite MacroVoices guest, a prominent fund manager who asked not to be mentioned by name, told me more than 6 months ago that he was convinced that World War III had literally begun more than a year earlier, but that it was a new doctrine of hybrid warfare in which part of the game is not to let your opponent figure out that he's even at war until as late as possible. Now, this particular individual had an elaborate thesis for how he believed that China was manipulating the U.S. financial system in a form of deliberate economic warfare. Then, a few months later, a second prominent MacroVoices guest shared with me privately off the air essentially the same conclusions, except his rationale for what was occurring and why it was occurring was completely different. Needless to say, two separate guests that I really respect and admire intellectually, both telling me that they thought World War III was already underway, really got my attention. But neither one of them wanted to speak about their views publicly for fear of being branded crackpot conspiracy theorists by an audience they assumed wasn't ready to hear such dire analysis. So I approached our friend Dr. Pippa Malmgren, a former U.S. presidential advisor who used to work in the White House, thinking surely she would be the voice of reason who could set me at ease and assure me that both of these gentlemen must be off their rockers to think such things. But when I asked Pippa to comment, her reply was, "Oh, did you read my piece on Substack titled World War III Has Already Started?" My jaw dropped. Now again, Pippa published that article with that title back on October 29th, long before this week's escalation in Ukraine. So the point I really want to impress upon our listeners is that long before anybody was talking about Ukraine, three separate highly respected MacroVoices guests, including Pippa Malmgren, have separately concluded that a new war between nuclear superpowers has already begun and is being fought with electrons more than bullets. This interview will, of course, focus on the situation in Ukraine, but will approach it from the broader context of why Pippa says World War III started quite a while ago, and why she thinks that the signs have been clear for many months that this degree of escalation was inevitable.
Well, Erik's interview with Dr. Pippa Malmgren is coming up as MacroVoices continues, right after this message from our sponsor.
Abex Technologies invites you to Smarter Markets' new podcast series, Demystifying Carbon Markets. Corporate climate pledges went mainstream in 2021. Moving into 2022, these companies are increasingly focused on developing and implementing plans to turn their climate pledges into climate action, and understanding how carbon markets can help them turn their good intentions into meaningful change. For many, however, carbon markets remain unfamiliar, creating apprehension over potential risks. They have many questions. What are carbon markets? What types of projects help reduce carbon emissions? How do I judge the quality of these projects? Will the carbon markets be large enough to meet net zero goals? In this series, Smarter Markets teams up with Base Carbon Corporation to bring you the architects and practitioners of the carbon markets, seeking answers to all of these questions from people who know the markets best. Episodes are available weekly on Saturdays beginning February 5th.
And now, with this week's special guest, here's hedge fund manager Erik Townsend.
Joining me now is Dr. Pippa Malmgren, former presidential advisor and best-selling author. Pippa, it's great to have you back on the show. Needless to say, this is a week where we need to talk.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Now, listeners, I know everybody is expecting us to talk about the Russia-Ukraine situation, and we're absolutely going to do that. But we're going to start with a bigger picture to frame some context. When we set this interview up, it was long before Russia-Ukraine had even blown up. And what brought this about was two separate MacroVoices guests, people whose names you know well, and I'm not talking about rando bloggers, but guys who run funds with hundreds of millions to low billions of dollars in them, have told me privately off the air, because they didn't want to go on record, saying they believe that World War III actually started a year ago. And when I heard that, I thought, holy cow, I can't believe I'm hearing what sounds like conspiracy theory from really prominent people in finance. And I thought, I know, I'll run this crazy talk past my friend Pippa, who used to work in the White House and knows how to debunk conspiracy theories. When I said that to Pippa, her reaction was, did you read my article on Substack titled World War III Has Already Begun? Pippa, holy cow. First of all, what is a fair-haired, patriotic American gal who used to work in the White House doing on Substack, the blogging platform, which is the anti-censorship platform for people like Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and people who have been censored from other internet platforms? What are you doing on Substack?
Well, I haven't been censored on other internet platforms. It's more that it's a great setup that allows a person to really write at length and provide deep dive analysis of situations. And yeah, there's a breadth of opinion on there, but I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the heart of politics. And my experience was that I know this is maybe horrifying to some people, but you need to talk to all sides and you need to consider all angles, right? That nobody has a monopoly on the truth. You have to really understand arguments that don't jibe with your own. So I'm very big on listening to people who are way outside my own comfort zone in my attempt to understand what's happening in the world better.
Pippa, let's start with your own article on Substack titled World War III Has Already Begun. And there's some follow-on articles that I read with great interest talking about where you see some of this warfare direction going. And it was very consistent with what I heard from the other people who asked not to have their names mentioned on the air. What they said is this is this new hybrid warfare doctrine where the whole idea is you're not fighting a shooting war with bullets. It's something where you're actually trying to get as far as you can before the other side even figures out that they're at war. Is that the same idea? What is this about? What's going on? And why are you talking about World War III?
Yeah, well, look, I come from a background where I've been working on strategic security issues and, studying military history since I was in my 20s. And I lecture at one of the top defense colleges in the world. I occasionally brief the generals in NATO. So I have, a sense of what is happening in the strategic security space. And you remember my book from 2015, Signals, I wrote quite a lot about what we're seeing now, which was the beginning of the breakdown of the agreement between the superpowers about the post-Cold War settlement. And I argued then that we were going to get more stress between the US and Russia and the US and China, which is exactly what has happened. As for the phrase World War III, which is, obviously provocative and hard for people to process. But, what's the definition of it? Well, it's very broad, covering a lot of geographies. And this is a thing I think people haven't understood. They think this is all about Ukraine. But in my opinion, we've been effectively at war. And I mean a kinetic war where you're actually facing off with equipment for quite some time. It's just happening in places the public can't see. So where are those places? I've called it a hot war in cold places. That's in space. And just two quick examples to give you an idea. We've recently, in the last few months, seen a number of events in space. One of them was the Russians basically blew up one of their own satellites to create a debris field that would prove to be very difficult and dangerous for American satellites in that orbit space, and actually for the International Space Station as well. we've also seen the Chinese make immense progress with their hunter-killer satellites. And one of them now can do what an American satellite can do, which is to drop out of its orbit, sidle up to somebody else's satellite, basically grab it almost like a Pac-Man, and hurl it into outer space, into what they call the dead zone, which is where that satellite is now useless to whoever put it into orbit. And so that's a very scary development, that we're having that level of space warfare. Oh, and by the way, the Chinese define the hunter-killer satellite as being something that cleans up debris, which sounds great, except it also seems to define American satellites as debris. So, we are definitely seeing the superpowers facing off in space. And what is that about? That is about challenging each other's capacity to communicate, to gather data, to frankly have access to GPS, all sorts of things. And so, as another example of the warfare that we're seeing, a few months ago, there was a very, very interesting and important incident in a tiny little island in the north of Norway called Svalbard, where we find the world's fastest internet cable. And it's a double cable. And what is it doing on this tiny little island in the middle of nowhere? Well, it turns out that Spalsat, the satellite company in Svalbard, uses this cable to basically connect pretty much most of the commercial and even military satellites to the Earth, including the International Space Station. So if you cut that cable, in theory, you cut off all of those satellites. Now, that cable was cut. It's now been determined by the Norwegian police that it was definitely not an accident from nature. It was deliberate, and it looks like it was done. The cable was cut in two different places, 4 kilometers apart, and the link between that 4 kilometers has gone totally missing. And they've now ransacked one of the oligarch's boats. Actually, I shouldn't call it a boat. It's like this massive vessel that looks like a military vessel, but it's a yacht. And so basically the allegation is the Russians cut the cable. And the head of the defense forces in the United Kingdom came straight out and said, this is an act of war because it is about turning off all of our satellites. And that, to put it in like basic perspective, because people don't get, what does this mean? That's like no more Uber Eats, right? That's no more GPS. That's a denial of service attack. That's not about you can't access a website on your computer. It's that you can't access the net. This is a whole different level of strategic threat. So let me go a bit further to finish on this. It also extends into other cold places like the Arctic, cyberspace, where we're seeing a whole lot of activity between the superpowers. I thought it was particularly interesting. Even just yesterday, I was supposed to fly from Europe and the UK to the US, but British Airways had a massive cyber event, which they're officially describing as a glitch that interrupted and canceled every single short-haul flight around Europe. But it happened within hours of British Airways announcing that they would no longer be flying to or over Russia. So maybe that's just an amazing coincidence. We'll leave it at that. And then finally, we're seeing it in places like Africa, which, although Africa is a hot place, it is a place that the media give quite a cold shoulder to. And what we see there is something very important and very interesting, which is the privatization of militaries over the last basically 20 or 30 years. And the Russians have something called the Wagner Group. The Americans have something called Academy that Erik Prince created. But basically, these are private militia who work for a fee. And in the case of Wagner, they're said to be President Putin's sort of private army. And there's no question that those two are facing off in Africa over raw materials and strategic assets. And so this is a hot war. It's just in a place the media gives a cold shoulder to. So that's the global context. I haven't even added in what's happening in Asia with China, Russia, in the Pacific as well. But the point is, Ukraine is occurring in the context of a much, much larger set of confrontations. And for this reason, it's hard to not describe it as a world war. And maybe the good news, and I'll finish on that. The good news is, war is modernizing just like everything else. And it's quite possible that World War III does not involve the kind of casualties and boots on the ground that World War I and World War II did. It is much more in the cyber and remote realms, including submarine warfare. So the public doesn't see it. It doesn't know it's occurring. It's relatively ignorant until it escalates into what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. And then suddenly everyone says, oh my God, we're at war. But they don't understand we're not in a local war. We're really in a world war.
Let's talk about why Ukraine specifically is not just a local event, but part of this bigger, broader context. Now, if you listen to a lot of the mainstream media coverage of this, it sounds like Vladimir Putin just basically blew a gasket, went nuts one day and decided to invade Ukraine for no apparent reason, as a lot of people have described it. But I thought it was interesting that former Democratic presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard tweeted the other day. She said this entire war could have been avoided if the West and NATO had simply been willing to acknowledge Russia's entirely legitimate concerns about encroachment on its borders. And just tweeting that caused several members of Congress to actually accuse Ms. Gabbard of treason. What's going on here? What is she talking about? Does she have a point? What is this idea that the whole thing could have been avoided if Russia's legitimate concerns had been considered? What legitimate concerns is she talking about?
So there are a couple layers to this. One is if we go back in history, and, for just to repeat, this, Eric, but so my father served Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, and he was very much involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis and diffusing that moment in history and preventing a terrible outcome there. And so he's been around all these years, and, he's quick to point out, NATO was never meant to be an offensive organization. It was meant to be a defensive organization. And there were many Republicans who warned President Clinton when he first came to office that we, the United States, should be careful about extending NATO membership. This is different from European Union membership or other kinds of organizations because NATO is all about mutual defense. And so as we pushed up along Russia's borders, there has been a movement eastward. And in America, the view was, well, we won the Cold War, and so that's the deal. You lose. And Russia, frankly, we've treated Russia as a kind of a puny, insignificant player since that time with an itsy-bitsy economy that doesn't even really score on the scoreboard, but forgetting that Russia's still a nuclear superpower. And maybe this particular leader, President Putin, remember, he's the guy who was in the Russian embassy in East Germany, in Berlin, when the Berlin Wall fell down and when the Cold War ended. And he's the one who had to burn, all the papers and save, who was in the embassy. And he has been very shaped by that moment of loss of the Soviet Union. And I think his whole life, he has been trying to restore the country to that previous glory. Now, he has an extreme view. It's not shared by the Russian people. It's very clear right now, based on the meeting with the Security Council that he held just earlier in the week, that most of his cabinet doesn't agree with him either. But he seems to have such a lock of control on everybody that people are afraid to say. I mean, he particularly was, asking his chief of foreign intelligence, and the guy made every effort to say, sir, I don't think we're going in the right direction. And he basically just was told to shut up. So, this question of did we go too far? I do think there is an open, an honest conversation to be had about, well, what did we gain from doing it? Did it actually serve us? And my key point here is that with nuclear weapons now and strategic tactical weapons as well, you don't even need proximity. So why do you need to move into countries that are right up on Russia's borders? You're going to be able to hit them more than cleanly from great distances. So the question again, is it really absolutely necessary? And I think that is going to be a question that will be addressed. I'll just go a little bit further on this point. The key thing now is, what do we do about the current situation? Because clearly we have a leader who is now threatening nuclear. And he's been crystal clear, and he has put the nuclear arsenal of Russia into combat mode. So it can be used at any moment. And this is why I think 36 nations at last count have closed their airspace. It is not because they're just trying to, keep the sky clear. There's because if there's a risk that someone is going to let off a nuclear weapon, they have to be able to see it and detect it and do what they can about it, which these days is not much. And they have to begin to think about offensive ability to stop that from happening. So I think the end game here, which again, it sounds just so strange, but in a sense, we're dealing with something. I've called it what we've called this in history. It's a kind of dead man's switch. Now, what is the dead man's switch? That was always the issue during the Cold War, that if you tried to take out the leader of the Soviet Union, that they would sort of rig things so that stuff would blow up if they weren't there. Right? It's like in a Hollywood film. It's not just that they might hit the button. It's that if they don't, or they take their finger off of a button, bad things happen. And the question is, has Putin put the world into a dead man's switch situation? And maybe this helps explain why the sanctions, while tougher than we've seen in the past, are still not that decisive. It may be because the leaders of the Western world recognize they're kind of dealing with a suicide bomber who's rigged to blow up and take a lot of hostages with him. And so maybe what you do, what the FBI does, which is you speak very, very nicely and very softly, and you offer them what they need, and you try to find an honorable way out, even though it's totally distasteful. But what's worse would be an actual use of nuclear weapons. And right now, is that a possibility? Well, every single person who has said that what Putin is doing is a bluff, I personally have said it's not a bluff. And I don't think this is a bluff either. And I don't think our nuclear experts believe it's a bluff. And therefore, gently, nicely, yes, maybe we should have a conversation about the rules of the game as you request. Maybe we should have Helsinki 2.0, which was the agreement that brought the Cold War to an end. And by the way, what a beautiful moment to have that now, because the world has 100% aligned behind the United States and NATO. So if he wants to have those talks, why not have them? Because he'll get the talks and we'll get the outcome. So I don't think that it's a terrible concession to say, let us rediscuss the post-war settlement. And oh, by the way, yeah, we did win. We still get to win. You lose. And at least the question is resolved for several generations to come. This whole issue goes away. But thinking that he's just going to back down and walk away, I just don't see how that happens. So we need to go very carefully here.
You said earlier that you welcome the fringe views and views from people who don't fall into the mainstream consensus. One of your contemporaries on Substack is Glenn Greenwald, the independent journalist who broke the Edward Snowden story several years ago. He published a video back on the 24th of February, about an hour and a half long. And in that video, what he's saying is, look, Putin is clearly completely out of line. But the reason that he's doing this is because of NATO encroachment on Russia's borders. And he describes how Barack Obama was outspoken in saying, look, Ukraine is very high value to Russia and very low value to us. It is not worth going and fighting with Russia over Ukraine. It doesn't benefit us to do that. And if I've understood Mr. Greenwald correctly, what he's saying is, as much as we might feel that Russia is totally out of line here, if NATO would just back off on this border issue, it would probably put this issue to bed and we wouldn't be talking about nuclear escalation. Does he have a point there, or is that naive in some way?
I look at it differently because I think that President Putin's objectives are so much broader than Ukraine. I think what he's trying to do is establish a foothold with each of the so-called exclaves. Then those are places like Donetsk and Luhansk, which he's already got in Ukraine, but Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, places we don't even really know where is that, on a map. But if you really look at it, what you see is there's a line that goes from the Mediterranean straight up to the Baltic Sea. And he is pushing into each of those locations. So another one is, and I think the most critical one actually after Ukraine, is what they call the Suwalki Gap. Now, the Suwalki Gap has been considered NATO's most vulnerable point for decades. And most people have never heard of it. But it's this tiny 64-kilometer stretch that runs between Kaliningrad, which is the biggest of the Russian exclaves. Kaliningrad is basically a little portion of Russia that sits on the Baltic Sea next to the Baltic states. And that 64-kilometer gap connects it to Belarus. Well, what's happened in Belarus in the last week, which some people haven't noticed, is the leader said, we're going to have all these Russian troops come to Belarus for temporary military exercises, including, lots of weapon systems. And then once the Russians arrived, he said, we're going to permanently allow them to stay. And by the way, we're changing our constitution so that we can deploy nuclear weapons here in Belarus. So now all of a sudden, Russia's effectively soft annexed Belarus and already had control over Kaliningrad. And so it's across the entirety of Europe, from the Baltic Sea down to the Mediterranean, where we also see a lot of Russian vessels, a lot of Russian presence. So I think that that's what he's doing. It's a much bigger picture than just Ukraine. The second thing is also, I think he totally misjudged. And he really expected that this was going to be a short and sharp action in Ukraine, that it would be regime change, it would be fast, it would be easy. It never occurred to the Russian side that the Ukrainians would fight back so powerfully that the world would align with the Ukrainians. And frankly, that the Russian side was ill-equipped, not just to take it, but even if they had succeeded, to control it in the aftermath. It's a kind of short-sightedness that's really very surprising. So I think, this is no longer about NATO is moving up against our borders. That's an excuse. That's a reason. But what he's really after is getting Russia physical footholds in strategic locations, using the excuse that Russian nationals are present in these places and they need Russian protection. And that excuse has turned out to be spurious, but very effective in allowing Russia to move into places that the world has never even heard of and can't identify on a map, which means they're not so likely to defend them.
Okay, Pippa, so this is not just about the argument that's been posited that Russia is simply trying to defend against encroachment of its borders by NATO trying to move into Ukraine. You mentioned something before. You said it's about a dead man switch. Tell us more. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're dealing with someone who's like a suicide bomber who's in a suicide vest, but he's got a whole room full of hostages, which is everyone in Western Europe. And this was always the worry in the Cold War. What happens if you tried to decapitate the Russian leadership? Then what terrible things might ensue? And so it's very distasteful, and it sounds, really awful to people that a bully can behave like this and then you just let them go. Or worse, you agree to sit down at a negotiating table with them. However, if you're trying to save the hostages, then frankly, this, is what you have to do, right? Your choices are really limited. And I think that's what we're looking at now for the future of Western Europe. And again, there's almost no risk in doing it because the whole world is aligned with the United States and NATO now. I mean, it's literally like neocons dream of this kind of alignment, of all the powers that be behind their way of looking at the world. But if you want to diffuse what is a very, very tricky situation, you may have to just, talk very nicely and offer some options. And by the way, even when we had the Helsinki Accords and, there was Ronald Reagan, I worked for Ronald Reagan at the time. There was Ronald Reagan, and he was all buddy-buddy with Mikhail Gorbachev and Edward Shevardnadze, and they were literally like best mates, by the end of the Helsinki process. But what we found out later was that the Russians had a massive bioweapons program. They were building, just tons and tons of particularly horrible bioweapons, and both Gorbachev and Shevardnadze knew about it. So I'm not saying that just because you hold Helsinki 2.0 that suddenly they'll, fly right and play nicely. They'll probably keep lying, but that's still a better situation than being at risk of a nuclear weapon. Now, the other hope, by the way, is that because his own team are not, very happy about this situation, that what will happen is his own people won't do the dirty work. And again, that's what's happened in history. Most people don't remember, but there was a guy called Stanislav Petrov back in 1983, and he was in charge of the kind of early detection of inbound ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles from the US. And the computer was showing that at least 5 ICBMs got launched by the United States. And his protocol was to absolutely hit the button and unleash nuclear Armageddon on the United States. But he decided that he just didn't think the US would ever do that. And so he didn't hit the button. And it turned out, in retrospect, it was sunshine bouncing off of the clouds that created what the computer interpreted to mean an attack. And he literally saved the world from nuclear Armageddon. And there was another one, a fellow called Arkhipov, who was the chief of staff and the second in command of the Russian fleet. He was on a Russian submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, there was a moment, and he refused to push the button on the nuclear torpedoes from his submarine and unleash them on American vessels in Cuba, and he saved the world. Are we probably depending today on this version of this generation? I suspect there's going to be some heroes who just refuse to push the button. And, this is where our belief and faith and the common man and the common woman, that good common sense, overrules craziness. And by the way, when we're done with all this is why I'm actually arguing. I know that everybody's smashing up vodka bottles in bars, and I understand the instinct. But you know what? We have a leader who's behaving in a certain way and who's ordering his army to do certain things. But we need to reach the point where we stop smashing the vodka bottles and instead we invite them to drink, because that is the way that we get out of these horrible situations where the fate of the planet is at risk.
Let's talk more about de-escalation and what needs to happen instead of smashing vodka bottles, because just Monday morning of this week, which, by the way, is the day that we're speaking, a few days before this will air for our listeners, there was a Russian television host, not speaking in any official capacity, but it's been speculated that it was perhaps intentionally leaked, had a commentary describing how easily, if Russia were threatened, if Russia's existence were threatened, and I think this is perhaps what you meant by the dead man switch, they very easily have the ability to direct their nuclear submarines to say, look, if Russia's gone, eliminate all life on the rest of the planet, because there's no reason to let anybody else live if they have attacked Russia. And he goes out of his way to explain in detail the number of warheads that could be launched from Russian submarines, the number that could be launched from Russian missiles, and so forth. Kind of seems like he did his homework and had all of his data in front of him, or maybe somebody handed that data to him. Is that what you mean by a dead man switch, that there's a threat basically saying, don't mess with us or we're going to blow the world up using nuclear weapons?
Yeah, that's the fear, is that is one example of what a dead man switch could be. And it can happen in lots of different ways. Another one of them is you could imagine that President Putin is thinking, well, if you won't move back, I will escalate. And he is clearly escalating, right? We're seeing cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. NVIDIA, for example, the chip maker just got hit. So again, let's remember the British only recently released a report about the use of thermonuclear weapons in space, which are all designed to destroy all of your communication systems. And is this a real issue? Yeah, it is. So the question is how to manage it as best as we can. Again, one's faith in humanity is that not everyone thinks that, if events occur, it's worth blowing the world up. But some people might think this way. I would point out as well that, we are this year on the 350th anniversary of the birth of Peter the Great, which is President Putin's sort of icon that he admires. And he always talks about restoring the borders of Russia, but he doesn't mean the Soviet borders. He means the imperial borders. And if you look at it, he is doing exactly that right now. So again, I think it's so hard for people to process nuclear conflict. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C. when we still had nuclear drills as well as fire drills, right? And once a month, you had to practice when the nuclear drill went off that you would dive underneath your desk. And, I don't know why anybody thought being underneath your desk was going to help you in a direct nuclear strike on Washington, D.C. But, this is the thing. We were in an era when it was understood that that was a real possibility. Today, young people have no memory of this. And yet our weapon systems are vastly more accurate, vastly faster. The Russians and the Chinese now have hypersonic weapons, which we have basically no response to. So is there a need to create kind of circuit breakers to find ways to talk rather than to test those systems? Test how far can we push this person? I'd say, again, talking is a whole lot better than finding out.
Let's expand this conversation because you said it's not just about encroachment of NATO on Russia's borders. That perhaps is part of it, but that wouldn't solve it. If NATO backed off of Ukraine, it wouldn't make this problem go away. You said that this is part of a bigger picture and that Russia's presence in Asia and the South China Sea is a part of this story. How does that fit in? What are we talking about here?
Oh, well, we're seeing the Russians be a lot more aggressive around the Kuril Islands, which are islands that they contest with Japan. And we've seen incidents between the Russian Navy and the American Navy in the Pacific as well. But also we've seen this alliance between China and Russia where they described each other as, having an unlimited partnership, basically. That was about the time of the Olympics. However, now, all of a sudden, the Chinese are quickly backing away and trying to take distance and saying to the Russians, you may be going too far. And that's very interesting because maybe Putin was quite emboldened by his belief that he had a new best friend and that their interests were totally aligned. And maybe the Chinese are being clever because they got Russia to throw some punches, which allowed them to see what are the reaction times and methodologies in the West, right? Quite often, this is very valuable information from a military strategic point of view. If you do this, then what happens? Well, they now know because they've seen the West and how they've reacted to Russia's various actions. And the Chinese maybe are saying, maybe we'll leave Russia to hang on their own, right? We back away. And again, if we end up in a situation where ultimately you end up with some kind of Helsinki Accord outcome, it would also isolate China and make it, in my opinion, even easier to negotiate with them and bring them to a point where they stop trying to behave in an adversarial way as well. And, this is what we want to get to, is a world where the superpowers can coexist without the regular person having to live under the threat of nuclear Armageddon being, an imminent or possible outcome. And so I think, the Russians were definitely emboldened by their belief that the Chinese were with them. And in fact, maybe they're not with them so much.
Okay, Pippa, I'm sure I'm not alone here. I don't fully understand this situation, but I know the outcome I want. I want the outcome where we have a de-escalation, where everybody stops talking about nuclear weapons, and Russia somehow either backs down or gets something that they want and stops escalating so that there is no further escalation of tensions. What are the ingredients that go into that recipe? How do we make that happen?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece again on Substack a couple of days ago on circuit breakers to stop the conflict from escalating. And I went back to Herman Kahn's landmark piece on this question of escalation. He was one of the only people brave enough to write about the possibility that nuclear war could genuinely come to pass. And so he was trying to figure out, how do we avoid it? So he went into great length in 1965 about how escalation happens and how it's uneven, that a little escalation can suddenly lead to a lot of escalation. And it doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in big jumps, a bit like how financial markets are, right? Everyone thinks it's going to be smooth, but it jumps around, the prices jump around a lot. It's the same with this. And so I think that we are going to end up in a situation where Russia withdraws. The Ukrainians will be heroes. I think they could end up managing to stay in Belarus and Kaliningrad. And the Suwalki Gap will be, let's say, the control over it will be lost by the West. This is going to put the Baltic states in a very precarious, tenuous position. And that is a real issue for NATO. It's also a big issue for the Scandinavian countries, who have definitely been responding to all this as if they are facing an existential threat. The Danes, they've ended up putting tanks on the island of Gotland, which is strategic in the middle of the Baltic Sea. The Swedes and I believe the Finns now have even said they all want to join NATO, where before they were like, we can't because we're right next door. We have to be neutral. Yeah, now they're like, after this, I'm definitely joining NATO. So I think we could end up with NATO expansion gets sort of permanently embedded. So there won't even be a question anymore. But there are some other aspects of this that could also be pursued, and it might be wise to pursue them. Now, one of the things that Putin has been asking for is basically a new strategic arms limitation talks, like the SALT talks that happened in the 70s. Where you basically come together and you say, here's what I've got. And it's not that you have to commit to not use it. It's just that as long as everybody doesn't know what weapons the other side has, there's fear. And particularly because these new weapon systems are so fast. I mean, we've had as much innovation in weapon systems as in all the other technology that we use every day. Why is this surprising to us? So do we need one that limits nuclear weapons or at least allows mutual inspection of what everybody has? Maybe that's not a bad idea. These days, in a world where you can spend $100 to buy a machine that will let you do genetic modification, do we need to have talks about bioweapons? Maybe actually that's not a bad idea. Do we need to have talks about lots of other kinds of weapons that are particularly destructive? Maybe this is not a bad idea. And again, let's not forget, when the Soviet Union came to an end, one of the side effects was all the money that we were spending on the nuclear arsenal and on all the weapon systems. We suddenly didn't need to spend that money anymore. And instead, it got diverted into productive use in the economy. And that led to a boom that lasted, a generation. And today, would we be better off with all of this defense spending going into the productive economy? I think we would. And maybe this, ironically, although it's not a very pleasant way to arrive at this conclusion, and no one would have wished this on the world, but actually, maybe it is worth thinking that these things might be wise. That is not to say that Putin wins. It is definitely not. But it is to say that if we want the world to win, maybe we have to think a little bit about some of the points that he's raised.
Pippa, something we discussed off the air is you actually see a possibility that this World War III trend that we're talking about could actually turn into an economic boom. What are you talking about?
Yeah. So look, like I said, I call it World War III because it's worldwide. It is our third conflict between the superpowers. But at least so far, I think it's not spreading into something that involves loss of life on the same scale as World War I and World War II, which is, I'm saying very carefully, the loss of life in Ukraine is unacceptable, no question about it. But if we can bring that to an end, and I do think it's possible to do that, it could be that World War III happened in the blink of an eye and did not result in the kind of worldwide devastation and loss of life that we've had in the past. And in fact, the conclusions that everyone reaches from this episode of conflict is that this is not where we want to be. And we're going to see governments investing everywhere in core critical infrastructure. They don't want to be depending, for example, on Russian gas and oil anymore. And we're probably going to see a lot of investment go into alternatives because of the oil price being so high, because of this newfound focus on, supply chains and not wanting to have the vulnerability of relying on a distant and far away supply chain with an unreliable supplier. And so this is kind of the new globalization, actually, that you will see investment in critical infrastructure everywhere in the world. And is that a good thing? Yeah, it actually is. We could strangely end up in a situation where the stock markets go way up, that because we will have forged a peace that will last for generations to come. No one after this will be brave enough to challenge NATO and the West. And the benefits of moving your creative thought process away from conflict, confrontation, and weapon systems and towards solving the problems for the future is immense. So I actually think we're going to see money going into massive technological innovation, public-private partnerships, because government is so constrained by its debt burden. They can't just write checks, but they do want companies to form. They do want business to come to life. And frankly, everybody in Central and Eastern Europe is going to say, wow, I need to create my own business because these people in politics are nuts. You can't depend on any of them. The state isn't going to be there for me. The Russians arrive and nobody comes to help. So that is going to spur an immense amount of entrepreneurial creativity, which I think can only be a very, very good thing. And again, we're lucky we live in a moment in history when technology is permitting such extraordinary outcomes. And we really are more and more able to solve the greatest problems of our generation with less resources, smaller businesses, right? It's not government and big corporates that are solving these problems. It's little startups. And are we going to have an explosion of little startups and government commitment to critical infrastructure at the same time? Yeah, we are. So I could see, again, as long as things don't go completely haywire, and let's hope that it doesn't, I think that the other outcome is actually, ironically, really good. And that's why World War III isn't like World War I and World War II. It's a completely different thing, maybe because we've learned, maybe because we have better technology. But I don't think that it means we're risking anything like what we saw in the previous two world wars.
Pippa, I cannot thank you enough for a terrific interview. It's so great to bring context to these just perilous issues that the world is suddenly facing. Before I let you go, though, tell us a little bit more about Pippa's Pen and Podcast, your new Substack platform.
Well, when I wrote my book, Signals, which was in 2015, which was all about helping people understand what was happening in the world economy without needing to be a professionally trained economist or a technical expert. It was about helping people see signals about what the future holds without needing to read through, econometrics. And I think that that approach has worked very well for me and a whole lot of people out there. So I'm effectively writing the sequel, which is really signals and how to make sense of the world, sense making. And instead of writing a book and then coming to market with the final book, I thought, well, I'll write it on an open platform where people can interact and give me their thoughts. And so I'm basically writing a book in the public domain, and it's all about the signals I see now. And so I'm talking about a lot of different subjects, at one end of the spectrum, new sources of innovation and new jobs in the economy coming from sectors you never heard of, all the way to geopolitics. But it's basically all about what's on the economic landscape that you should be aware of.
And that's all at drpippam for Dr. Pippa Malmgren .substack.com. Patrick Ceresna and I will be back as MacroVoices continues right after this message from our sponsor. I've talked with several guests about topics like inflation and fears of a market correction, and those are real concerns for many investors. I'm sure many of you are wondering where to put your money. Many investors are turning to alternative assets for protection. You could look into traditional assets like gold, real estate, and bonds, but there's one unexpected asset everyone's talking about lately: blue chip art. Its growth has outpaced the S&P 500 from 1995 through 2020. And it has almost no correlation to other asset classes. In other words, its value doesn't drop as much as other investments when markets crash. Most people don't realize you can now invest in million-dollar art by Banksy, Monet, and even Picasso. To discover how to access this asset class, visit masterworks.art/macrovoices. That's masterworks.art/macrovoices. See important disclosures at macrovoices.io/disclaimer.
Now, back to your hosts, Erik Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
Erik, what a great interview with Pippa. I'm so glad we got her on. It's so important, and the point she's making is that we have to step back and stop being so emotional about this and recognize, how do we get to a solution? And the solution is to how to avoid a hot war, especially if it involves nuclear armaments and things like that. But anyway, the one thing I did really enjoy was the fact that she got to the idea of the economic boom that is going to result on the other end of this. And the one thing I do believe is that as we move away, there's going to be this movement toward reversing some of the globalization we saw, and very important strategic things are going to be brought back into, let's say, America, such as semiconductors and other things, in order to secure that supply. And maybe there's an enormous opportunity that's going to come from that. It's certainly something that's got me thinking. What did you take away from the interview?
Patrick, the main thing I want to remind our listeners of is that we had Pippa and two other prominent MacroVoices guests who prefer not to be named, all telling us that World War III had already begun months before this escalation in Ukraine. In my opinion, most of the world is learning about the situation in Ukraine in isolation through the mainstream media and without context, as if Putin suddenly just decided to invade Ukraine one day for no particular reason. No context, no background, no history. In reality, this has been coming for a long time, and the reasons that it's been coming for a long time have been the subject of a much broader and farther-reaching discussion than the mainstream media are reporting. But Patrick, I want to move on now to our post-game chart deck, which is titled Intermarket Frenzy. What's next? Listeners, you'll find the download link in your Research Roundup email. If you don't have a Research Roundup email, just go to our homepage, macrovoices.com. Look for the red button that says Looking for the Downloads. Patrick, looks like we've got the S&P 500 on page 2. What's going on here?
Right. So we're talking about that breakdown that occurred at the 200-day moving average last week, and we were asking whether it was a point of capitulation. And clearly, we did get the reactionary bounce off of that 4,100 low. Now, there was obviously an almost immediate slingshot rally the other way that saw several hundred S&P points to the upside, making many people believe that this was like a big bottom. But what we continue to see is consolidation below below a lot of key moving averages, and more importantly, below even the September-October lows. A lot of these things still suggest vulnerability in the market. The way that I kind of look at it is that it's really up to the bulls, whether in the next trading session or early next week, to really punch this north of 4,500 with some real velocity to put to bed that the downtrend is over. The longer and every day we trade below 4,500 and particularly below 4,400, the more vulnerable it is that there's another leg lower, potentially to 4,000 or lower on the S&P coming next week. So it's really it's a bounce, and it's so far actually kind of a pathetic bounce. And really, the bulls better put this together, or otherwise there's still another round of weakness coming.
What's the VIX telling us on page 3?
And that's the other thing that I think is worthy of noting is simply that while the market did bounce and rally, typically this comes with what's known as a Vanna slingshot, which is essentially as volatility collapses, it causes dealer buying, which actually drives those markets higher. That entire rally or reaction in the S&P 500 has come with elevated levels of volatility, which is essentially volatility is staying up here, and that in itself is maybe a red flag. If we, in fact, were at a market bottom and things were normalizing, we probably should have been under 25 on the VIX and heading lower. But I guess the geopolitical tension is forcing markets to keep higher volatility premiums in buying all your hedges and protection on the portfolio insurance and things like this, which is keeping it higher. But that in itself could actually be a warning that the S&P may not be done correcting. And to me, every day that the VIX stays at around this 30 level and doesn't head lower, the increased chance that the S&P still has one more leg on the downside. It is worth noting, Eric, that when we go, I don't have the charts on global equity, but whether you're talking the Nikkei, whether you're talking the Euro stock, we're seeing still very weak global developed markets. And you would think that if this was a real buy on dip opportunity and the market was worth accumulating, that we should have seen a much broader accumulation cycle that is stemming across most global markets. And yet weakness is everywhere, in particularly in an environment where a lot of risk off assets are working and pressure from oil. I still think the markets are generally vulnerable here.
Speaking of weakness being everywhere, let's take a look at the euro on page 4. It looks pretty darn weak.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, the euro had every reason to try to put in a short-term low, but ever since this escalation happened, we saw close to a 400 pip, maybe even closer to a 500 pip drop in the euro over the span of the last 3 weeks. And this really does potentially set in motion a drop that may retest the multi-year lows closer to the 108, 109 level. There could certainly be another even 200 pips downside risk here, and that certainly could be the underpinning conditions that drive the dollar index up toward the 100 level. And so it'll be really interesting to see whether this trend that's now been set in motion just keeps going. It's certainly the path of least resistance at this moment.
Let's move on to page 5, gold futures. Not much happening considering the geopolitical upset that we've seen this week.
Well, while I, in principle, agree with you, I think that the one observation to make is that overall, gold has been actually behaving very well. If you look at the bigger span of the entire 2021 year, we saw gold trading in an incredibly narrow sideways range that basically can be identified just by noticing that the moving averages were flat and just literally pivoting off of each other back and forth around the 1800 level. What we're finally seeing is a legitimate bull breakout. And more importantly, every dip is being bought. And while we have not seen that big gold upside reaction yet, the interesting thing is sometimes it starts quietly and then ends with a bang on the upside. And the question here is if we continue to see that these tensions are continuing to play out and things are not de-escalating, and suddenly gold starts clearing 2,000 on the upside, it might be a big enough headline that suddenly it becomes on everyone's radar and focal point, and then we could really see some real money flow coming in here. I think that the way that gold is behaving, you got to give the bulls the benefit of doubt here and respect this new trend that is trying to establish itself.
Let's move on to crude oil on page 6.
Yeah, like I really don't know if I have any big technical observation to make. You can certainly, share what's your views on this, but it really has gone parabolic. We've now really seen this almost runaway oil market. The one thing, whenever you see parabolic breakouts in markets where they move this fast, it's very hard to attempt, or it's even very bold to try to predict how far it will go. Usually, though, when you have a blow-off kind of rally like this, after the move happens, it usually has a pretty deep mean reversion. It'll be one of the more interesting things will be for me is how high will the bulls squeeze this thing to the upside before we see some sort of legitimate short-term swing high. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be big picture bullish oil, but at some point one has to think that this kind of a short-term squeeze is going to have some serious volatility in both directions. What's your take on that?
Well, one of the things that's on the table is an Iran nuclear deal could be very close at hand. I don't really read nearly as much bearish meaning into that as most people seem to. Yeah, it means Iranian oil would be back on the free market, at least until such time as Iran and Russia decide to go do something else on their own. With respect to really changing anything, how much of the Iranian oil was already being sold on the black market? How much is this really going to change anything? And with all the other pressures going on, I don't think that the Iran nuclear deal, putting Iranian oil back on the market, would be the game changer that some people seem to think it is. Clearly, the Russia-Ukraine situation has been what's dominating all of this upside pressure. How much farther could it go to the upside? I don't think there's any real limit. If we get to a point where Russia cuts off all of its exports and won't sell any oil or gas to Europe or the West, I think that potentially creates a very difficult situation for the West to cope with, and it will then start to bring into question how much spare capacity of the spare capacity that OPEC has claimed to have does OPEC really have when push comes to shove, and I think prices could move quite a bit higher, but we'll see what happens. But Patrick, let's move on to uranium on page 7. What's going on there?
Well, last week we touched on the idea of whether or not uranium was breaking out, and it was. And it certainly has now started. What's interesting is that this is a very early stage of a breakout. And while we've seen a lot of markets already take off, uranium has been one of the quieter sectors. But right now, with a movement towards finding alternative ways of providing energy, with the idea that, we're seeing the movement even in coal, the movement in uranium, all of these things are starting to fire up. It'll be really interesting to see whether there's another full bull run coming in these spaces, but certainly a legit breakout in uranium, and totally worth watching as to whether there's another full new multi-month trend emergent here.
And, of course, the commodity to really watch is the one that is grown in both Russia and Ukraine, which is wheat on page 8. What's going on here?
Yeah, obviously the disruption of wheat supply that would typically come from the areas that are embroiled in this confrontation has certainly squeezed wheat. But it's not just wheat. We're seeing big moves in corn, in soybean. All sorts of things are moving. And so right now with wheat, it's just absolutely ripping higher in a parabolic fashion. It's certainly such a huge percentage move in such a short window of time, but it's not even that. It's the velocity of the move now that is happening. There's a legitimate squeeze, and arguably it's moving at a faster pace than even crude oil is, and certainly worth watching to see how far this market goes. It's kind of late, I think, to almost be grabbing at it to the upside, but I certainly am not interested in fading this on the short term. It's one of the hottest markets right now, and it'll be interesting to see whether it clears the 12 and 13 levels on the upside.
And pages 9 and 10, better hold your breath. These are the Russian ruble and the Russian stock market.
Yeah, I put the ruble first. Normally, it's looked at the other way, but we saw a 35% drop in the currency in a span of 2 weeks. Clearly, there is a financial element to this war now. The sanctions, the limit of trading. There's a whole secondary element now that's coming into play, and they're certainly going to try to cripple Russia through the currency and their stock markets, and it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. But one way or another, just enormous moves in the currency markets. And when we look at their stock market, just an extraordinary drop. Like the ETF has gone from like $33, $34 back in the fourth quarter of last year to have traded down to $5. That's just a complete decimation of their equity markets. And so certainly this is now played out. The question now is, will we even see a delisting of these types of ETFs that invest into Russia? Certainly that's already started on some of the ETFs out there. But boy, has this been a pain trade for those that were sticking their neck out trying to buy the dip.
Listeners, if you enjoy Patrick's chart decks, you can get them every single day of the week with a free trial of Big Picture Trading, Patrick's service. You can find information on page 12 of the slide deck or at bigpicturetrading.com. We're going to leave it there for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by Abex Technologies, pioneering the design of smarter markets that better serve the needs of both market participants and society as a whole. And by Masterworks, the billion-dollar alternative investment platform that lets you invest in art by legends like Warhol and Picasso for a fraction of the cost. Patrick, tell them what's in this week's Research Roundup.
This week, you're going to find the transcript for today's interview, as well as a link to the chart book we just discussed here in the postgame, and a number of links to articles that we found really interesting. So you'll find this and so much more in this week's Research Roundup. That does it for this week's episode. We appreciate all the feedback and support we get from our listeners, and we're always looking for suggestions on how we can make the program even better. Now, for those of our listeners that write or blog about the markets and would like to share that content with our listeners, send us an email at researchroundup@macrovoices.com, and we will consider it for our weekly distributions. If you have not already, follow our main Twitter account at MacroVoices for all the most recent updates and releases. You can also follow Erik on Twitter at Erik S. Townsend. That's Erik spelled with a K, and myself at Patrick Ceresna. On behalf of Erik Townsend and myself, thank you for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
That concludes this edition of MacroVoices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. MacroVoices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com, the Internet's premier source of online education for traders. Please visit BigPictureTrading.com for more information. Please register your free account at MacroVoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free listener discussion forums and research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at macrovoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to MacroVoices on iTunes to have MacroVoices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week free of charge. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer your questions on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. MacroVoices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on MacroVoices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on MacroVoices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. MacroVoices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts Erik Townsend and Patrick Ceresna shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on MacroVoices. MacroVoices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com and by funding from Fourth Turning Capital Management, LLC. For more information, visit macrovoices.com.